Today's episode is brought to you by Morgan Talty's Night of the Living Res, a debut collection of stories that Brandon Hobson calls beautifully crafted, raw, and intimate. Set in a native community in Maine, Night of the Living Res is about what it means to be Penobscot in the 21st century, and what it means to live, to survive, and to persevere after tragedy. In 12 striking, luminescent stories, Talty breathes life into tales of family and a community as they struggle with a painful past and an uncertain future. Says Laura Vandenberg, "I love these sharply atmospheric, daring, and intensely moving stories, each one dense with peril and tenderness. Morgan Talty is a thrilling new talent." Night of the Living Res is out on July 5th from Tin House and available for pre-order now. Today's guest, Hernan Diaz, in talking about his new book, Trust, has sometimes called the entire book a spoiler, which in some ways is true. But reviewers and Hernan himself seem to have come to a similar strategy with regards to what to mention or not to mention when talking about it. And I wanted to speak to that for a moment before today's conversation and say that I too follow these conventions that have been set up. Conventions that allow a discourse about trust and yet preserve the pleasures of discovery. I never go farther than what is commonly out there, and for the most part speak of less than you'd regularly find reading about the book. That said, in the last 25 minutes, we dwell on an aspect of the book that, while frequently mentioned elsewhere, if you yourself are particularly concerned about spoilers, you could listen to the vast majority of this conversation, one that is largely about form and about voice, and save the last 25 minutes until after you read the book. And we talk about form and voice because, in a strange way, form and voice are so important to this book that they are almost characters unto themselves. Certainly, they are each very present forces that are continually shaping and reshaping, building up and tearing down the story you are reading. So while it sometimes might seem like we aren't talking about the book, but circling it, we are somewhat paradoxically doing both. If you enjoyed today's conversation, and perhaps even past conversations with everyone from Jenny Erpenbeck and Alejandro Zambra to Teju Cole and Natalie Diaz, consider joining the Between the Covers community by becoming a listener supporter. Every listener gets a resource-rich email with each episode and can join the ongoing brainstorm of which writers to invite into the future. And there are a ton of other things available to choose from access to the bonus audio with readings and sometimes even craft talks or literary analysis, and long-form conversations with translators, to various collectibles from everyone from Ursula K. Le Guin to Nikki Finney. You can check it all out at patreon.com/betweenthecovers. And now for today's conversation with Hernan Diaz. Good morning and welcome to Between the Covers. I'm David Naiman, your host. Today's guest, the novelist writer Hernan Diaz, was born in Argentina, but grew up in Sweden, speaking Swedish out in the world, until his family moved back to Argentina again at the age of 9. Diaz pursued a Bachelor's of Arts in Literature at the University of Buenos Aires, moved to London in his 20s and went to King's College there for his master's degree, and then finally moved to New York, which he has called home for over 20 years, and where he pursued a doctorate in philosophy from New York University, taught at State University of New York, and where he is now Associate Director of the Hispanic Institute at Columbia University and Managing Editor of Revista Hispánica Moderna, a semi-annual peer-reviewed journal devoted to research in Hispanic literature and cultural studies. In 2012, he published the book Borges, History and Eternity, that explores, among other things, the very different way Borges is seen and situated within Latin America versus the rest of the world, how the Borges engaged with literary history and the Borges abstracted from history, the conceptual and universal Borges of metaphysical puzzles, can each be found in the opposite. But Hernan Diaz first became well known for his debut novel, despite its humble origins in the slush pile at Coffee House Press. This book, In the Distance, received starred reviews from Library Journal and Publishers Weekly, had its praises sung by everyone from Roxane Gay to Lauren Groff, was longlisted for the International Dublin Literary Award, was a finalist for the Faulkner Award, and a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in Fiction. The winner of the Soroyan International Prize and the Cabell Award for Best First Novel, and it was picked as a Best Book of 2017 by Feminist Press and one of the 20 Best Novels of the Decade by LitHub. Diaz went on to win a Whiting Award in 2019 and a Guggenheim in 2022, and in the Whiting Award citation, they say, Hernan Diaz explores two kinds of wilderness, the immensely taxing newness of the American West, and the still-forming interiority of Håkan, a Swedish immigrant desperate to find a way back home. It's the second that makes the first feel new. He does this in language that can be plain-spoken and wildly, even cosmically evocative. Håkan's epic journey reminds us how the self is often hammered into existence by pain and longing. In the end, the reader understands the country's twin potential for horror and hope. So it's with no small amount of anticipation that we've awaited Hernan Diaz's follow-up to this tremendous entry into the world of novel writing. And despite the high expectations, he has dazzled us once again with a book entitled Trust that, like his last novel, engages with the mythology of America, this time not that of the American frontier, but of American finance. But unlike his last book, this polyvocal book, you could say, is a masterclass in voice, as well as being a formal and narrative puzzle, one that enlists the reader as a sort of textual detective. With starred reviews from BookPage, Publishers Weekly, Kirkus, and Booklist, the latter says in its review, for all its elegant complexity and brilliant construction, Diaz's novel is compulsively readable, and despite taking place in the early 1900s, the plot reads like an indictment of the start of the 21st century, with its obsession with obscure financial instruments and unhinged capital accumulation. A captivating tour de force that will astound readers with its formal invention and contemporary relevance. Rachel Kushner adds, Trust glints with wonder and knowledge and mystery. Its plotlines are as etched and surreal as Art Deco geometry, while inside the architecture are people who feel appallingly real. This novel is very classical and very original. Balzac would be proud, but so would Borges. Finally, Maureen Corrigan for NPR says, literary fiction is a fantastic commodity in which our best writers become criminals of the imagination, stealing our attention and our very desires. Diaz makes an artistic fortune in trust, and we, readers, make out like bandits too. Welcome to Between the Covers, Hernan Diaz.
Hi, David. Such a pleasure to be here, and thank you for that generous introduction. It was a beautiful and humbling essay almost. Thank you.
Well, I think there are many ways we could connect your last book, In the Distance, a Western or anti-Western, and your latest book about capital and the American mythology around it. But it feels like most people seem to be talking about the ways they're different. And I do think the reading experience, what you ask of the reader, and the reader's relationship to the book as a book is very different. And I wanted to start here with that difference and see whether there is a relationship between subject and form. If something about switching from the American frontier to a question of the accumulation of capital prompts you to move from a book told from one point of view to a book that is not only polyvocal, but one that is a nested puzzle of sorts. So talk to us about money, how money has or hasn't shaped the form of the book Trust.
Starting with the beginning of your question about the differences, the formal differences between these two books, for me, each project begins with an emotional texture that is almost abstract, and it's vaporous and misty and not cohesive at all. It's just that it's a feeling. There's no other word for it. And within the distance, it was a combination of solitude and disorientation. Later on, this all coalesced into the narrative that became the book, and it turned out that this radical solitude is essential also to certain version of the American dream, one that presents the hero as an Adam-like figure that is almost beginning history anew. So individualism, I think, happened to be. It would become a common denominator also with trust, but understood in a very different way. But this glorification of the individual, I find to be very American. Of course, in the distance was a critique of that, and hopefully subverted it in productive ways. But now speaking directly to form, I was very interested in this. In hovering very closely around this body and this consciousness that is the protagonist, and I was striving to create a sense of almost claustrophobia and suffocation that would be dissonant with the vastness and the openness of the landscape in which the protagonist finds himself. So I was very interested in this friction between an almost solipsistic confinement and then this vast sublime expansion of the American territory, and that was sort of a formal drive for the book. And reading it, you may also see how the book oscillates between this very suffocating introspection and then the more expansive passages, and that is part of the economy of the book, to start introducing that term. Trust likewise began with a feeling. I knew I wanted to write about wealth because it's such a constitutive part of the American imagination. I didn't know how to do it. And I also was interested in the emotional texture of what I imagined came with extreme wealth. I should make a footnote here and say I'm not just talking about a privileged man here or a privileged family. I'm talking about the richest man in America, and therefore probably the richest man in the world. This is the kind of excess that I was interested in imagining. Of course, I have no direct access to this experience, and the emotional texture that I was referring to was not unlike In the Distance. Come to think of it, was the sense of extreme confinement and removal that I imagine must come with that sort of fortune, on the one hand, and on the other hand, the total and absolute reach that comes with wealth. So this opposition was very productive to me. Then I started thinking about money and reading about money, and as you pointed out in your generous introduction, I have a background in academia and in theory and in philosophy. So I started thinking about this almost in theoretical terms, and the first thing, which almost uh, threw me off the whole project was that I realized that money is, and a fortune is made up of many mediations. Like, there's nothing monolithic about it. It's the multitude of laboring people that goes into it, a number of institutions, a number of social contracts, and different forms of, I'm not trying to be a punster here, but different forms of trust too, of confidence, that go into a fortune. So it became very clear to me that it couldn't be narrated in the same way as in The Distance, which was this very focus centered point of view. This had to be it had to contain a modest multitude. It had to be there had to be a multiplicity here, and also because in the myths that go into narrating the origin stories of every great fortune is ill-begotten. I mean, there's no doubt in my mind about that. It's every fortune is criminal. Therefore, every fortune needs to surround itself by this legitimizing kind of narrative. And here's where voice comes in. So I thought I wanted to play with the expectations that come with these very established voices that provide legitimacy to a fortune, and that sort of cleanse or clean its foundational myths.
What you hinted at here, and you've talked about elsewhere, you're attracted to what you call highly fossilized narratives, and a desire to engage with fossilized narratives and subvert them. And both of these books are looking at the stories that America tells about itself. But it seems contrary to your debut, where there are innumerable stories told about the West and the frontier. There's just a vast number of narratives about the West in all sorts of art forms and American expansion. You said that what piqued your interest about trust was actually the absence of stories about capital. And I was hoping you could talk about that, because I can think of a lot of books about class, about wealth, about poverty, but you're talking about something different, I think. And I would be interested to hear about this absence you're seeing, why story isn't being made. You've mentioned that the industrialists themselves might be making stories, but why books aren't making stories the way they do in Westerns and anti-Westerns?
I also saw a void in the Western as a genre too. I think, again, maybe there is a common denominator here. We think there are a lot of stories about the West. We think there are, but like, can you name off the top of your head like 5 relevant Western novels before the 50s? It's hard. It's really hard. We think of film, of course, which is immensely important, but even the gestation of the Western as a genre is extremely late. It starts in 1902 or 03 with The Virginian by Owen Wister. That is the acknowledged sort of starting point. And think of 1903, like the Civil War is over, the conquest of the West itself is over. Native peoples have been decimated thoroughly. Extensive sort of agriculture has been introduced. The landscape has been effectively tamed. It's over. In short, it's over. And it's only then when the Western is properly codified and structured as a genre, right? This to me is already very interesting. And then you have the anti-Westerns, but the novels against which those anti-Westerns are written are not really like relevant. They're not part of the conversation. It was only last year, or the year before last actually, that the Library of America, sort of this venerable collection that sort of canonizes different American authors, it was only 2 years ago that they came out with a Western collection. It ultimately doesn't matter, but I think it's an eloquent example of what I'm trying to say. it seems that only by adopting the prefix anti, by negating itself, that the Western can become sort of legit and become part of the quote unquote highbrow conversation, right? This to me is an interesting phenomenon in itself, because we would expect that the Western would be the American sort of national genre, and it just simply isn't, not in literature at all. Um, with money, there is something similar. Just as the Western is there to glamorize some of the darkest aspects of American history, including genocide, one would also think that since money occupies this almost transcendental place in American culture, that there would be, a vast canon, a vast corpus of literature fiction that revolves around money and money making. And again, we would all be hard pressed to come up with that list. We would have to rack our brains and maybe make some concessions. It's not immediately obvious and apparent what those books are. I found very few that to me are satisfactory. As you said, on the other hand, of course, American literature has been obsessed with class and sort of the corseted manners that come with it, and we have even sort of almost a genre about that, sort of the novel of manners, and that's very important in American literary history. There is also sort of a very rich, let's call it American social realism, sort of, and I would group there disparate authors such as, I don't know, Theodore Dreiser, John Steinbeck, Erskine Caldwell, which deal with the flip side of the narratives of excess, sort of the misery brought about by inequality. And then there's also, I would say, a third set of novels that deal with conspicuous consumption, let's call it that, to quote Veblen. They present themselves as critiques of this world of excess, but I feel all of them, or most of these books, end up bedazzled by the very thing that they set out to critique. And I think there's a whole arc that goes maybe from Scott Fitzgerald to, I don't know, Bret Easton Ellis, for example. I don't know, and everyone in between, but that's almost like a full century right there. In none of these three groups that I just sort of made up as I went, in none of these groups there are novels that are about money making. They all deal with the effects of money, with the symptoms of affluence, or with the tragedy of exploitation, but money is never made in these novels. Money is already there, and this is a massive distinction. I wanted to write a novel about money making, and how once that astronomical amount of money is made, how its density, how its mass affects the reality around it. This became the project.
I love this distinction, this idea that money is just around in all these novels about wealth, and the questions that raises, like what won't be spoken about and why, and what culture is created in order to sort of preserve a silence around how the money arrives. As maybe one last moment of staying with your two books together, I wonder if this could be a spectral connection between the two books, that the accumulation of wealth by the wealthy people in trust is predicated on, as you've just mentioned, the erasure of hidden and the hiding of labor, whether that labor be literal slavery or wage slavery or the exploitation of the working poor in some fashion. But it is also very much connected, I would imagine, to the conquest and the settlement of the West, stolen land, resource extraction, and then the accumulation of wealth in centers of commerce, where the people who have it then live within a culture that doesn't just erase the means, but sort of disdains work and disdains the notion of labor. So you don't speak about it because it's kind of gauche on aesthetic terms.
Exactly.
But maybe it isn't a coincidence that in your first book that the immigrant is walking west to east in your anti-Western, that he's walking toward New York quite visibly, but also that the West perhaps is also possibly an unspoken ghost that's haunting the New York of trust. And I wondered if that's too much of a stretch to suggest that there's a Western ghost unspoken in the latest book of commerce in America's biggest city.
I don't think it's a stretch at all. And as I didn't set out to write a book that would be sort of an ideological continuation of at all. That's not the way I work. It just really happened, and maybe it speaks to hidden interests that are sort of form a continuum in my mind, but it wasn't intentional. But I have very little to add to what you said, because I think it's all correct, and I agree. I think although romanticized, the push west was not just an adventure. It was an extractivist endeavor that utterly commodified nature and brutalized it in order specifically to fuel the machinery of capital that had started with the Industrial Revolution. That's what it was. That's what it was. I mean, gold is slightly a different story, because gold is such a weird commodity, and I think it's above my pay grade to really discuss the specificity of gold, because it's really super complex, and its entanglement with monetary policy in the United States is fascinating. So I would leave gold slightly aside for a moment, but the rest, from water to pastures to other minerals to human labor, that was the purpose of the push to the West. Absolutely, it wasn't out of some sort of curiosity, or it wasn't well-intended naturalists and poets who went out there. It was all about money, and obviously, and now we see this machinery running full steam ahead in trust, and so in that regard, there is without a question a continuity between those two things, and I think labor in both of those cases has been, you used the word gauche, which I think is amazing in this context, because also when I said that money is there, it's never made in most of American literature, I think it has to do with almost like a puritanical kind of prudishness, which is very strange, because on the one hand, there is this Calvinistic sense that, material fulfillment in this world is a sign of your redemption in the next one. So there is that, which gives wealth this literally transcendental dimension. But at the same time, it's just not something that's talked about, because it's almost impolite. So there is a priggishness there around it as well. And we see this going back to manners, since we were talking about priggishness. You see this in very clearly in Edith Wharton, and also in Henry James, that there really isn't labor for the most part. We could think of a few exceptions, but in some of their stories, artists are one of those exceptions. There are a lot of working artists in their stories, but for the most part, money is simply not talked about. And Wharton, in her autobiography, A Backward Glance, says this in so many words, like in her set, to use a word from the time, in her set, in her world, you just don't work. It's frowned upon. It's frowned upon. And you certainly also, by the way, you don't if you're even more so if you're a woman, you don't make art, you don't write. She was discouraged from writing.
Yeah. Well, eventually, I want to make an argument that the book isn't about money at all, that it could have been set in a very different climate, one without money, and many of its central animating questions could still exist. But I'm not ready to make the argument yet. But first, I wanna talk about the non-financial meaning of the title trust. When people think of the term today financially, they probably think of putting money in a trust or a trust fund. But in the context of your book, which does span a century from 1880 to the 1980s, but whose lifeblood is the 20s and 30s, in that context, a trust would be a monopoly, and that we might have antitrust laws, which we used to have, which would break up companies to restore competition. But let's talk about trust in the emotional sense and how you call into question the contract between the reader and the writer, the same contract most writers try to foster and nurture.
That was a good ending to that setup. So you're basically calling me a con man in a very elegant way.
Not really.
Yeah.
Most of my favorite books actually do what you do. I'll say one thing before you answer this that I really love, and I just want to stress this because we're going to talk a lot about form, but I think of your book, when I think of like Alice Munro or Philip Roth, not that your writing's anything like either one of them, but they're rarely ever considered experimental writers, but they're wildly experimental writers. And I think part of the reason why we don't think of them as experimental writers is because they're also really immersive writers. You go inside of their books. And so you might not be entirely aware when Munro does this crazy thing with time, or the entire story is backstory, all these violations of the typical rules. But I wonder, I feel like reading your book, even though we're going to go and like the structure of it, that each of the 4 sections is super immersive on its own. So even though we're going to talk about the strange ways they're related to each other, you could read Trust as an enjoyable ride without being the textual detective that you suggest you could be if you wanted to. And I think that I love that sweet spot personally, where I feel like the reading experience is very inviting. And at the same time, you're rewarded if you're willing to go farther than just the reading of it.
That's great. I mean, there's so many things to address in what you just said. I don't think it's a question. I think it's a great intervention with which I fully agree. And as you were talking about experimental fiction, that we don't realize is experimental, and I can think of other authors who I would put in that category too, which now I love. I hadn't thought of it. And this is totally off the cuff, I would say we don't think of them as experimental because the experiment has succeeded. One could claim that a lot of the experimental fiction that I love, that is ostensibly experimental, is because the experiment is still in a way in progress, right? And that's the nature of experimentation. Experimentation is based on repetition and right, and it's a term that I quibble with in fiction, right? Because experimental, that adjective, I take issue with it. Although again, I understand what it refers to, and I align myself mostly with writers whom you would call, without flinching, experimental. But if we think about the word itself, it has to do, well, it's a word that comes from science. So that already to me puts me on high alert, because there are epistemological problems that immediately you immediately inherit when you take on a scientific term without caution. the first problem is the idea of repetition that I just meant. I mean, what defines an experiment is that you should be able to perform it over and over again. This already goes against the nature of experimental fiction. Like it's always one of a kind, and it's like a weird bird that cannot be repeated, literally. So that would be my first objection. The second objection, which is much more substantial, is that experiment is sort of a derivative of experience. It's sort of it's not a proper experience. It's a controlled experience. It's a fake experience. It's an artificial experience. That is what an experiment is, because you need to be able to measure everything that's going on within that artificial experiment. So you set the parameters for that experience. And I feel that, again, with many air quotes, experimental literature, what it does is it gives us an experience. Like, the more successful those pieces of writing are, the more intense the experience is. So there's nothing fake or controlled about it. It's almost the opposite. They're almost always out of control. And the third objection I would raise to the notion of experimental literature is that experiment in science tends toward some kind of measurable truth, quantifiable truth, some kind of final assertion. And I think you're trying to establish an empirical fact. That's why you make the experiment to begin with. And I think experimental literature does just the opposite. It just keeps opening the realm of the imaginable instead of narrowing it down. So I preface this by saying it was a bit of a quibble. It became a bit of a rant.
Oh, not at all. But I'll just add, this makes me think of a conversation many years ago with Talia Field, who wrote the book Experimental Animals, where she looks at the rise of vivisection in France and the influence it had on Zola's what he considered experimental. Oh, sure. Though I super love this idea that the analogy breaks down because of the non-reproducibility of the experimental art.
Yes.
Let me take this question further. So if we're talking about, part of this book is this examination of this contract between the reader and the writer.
That's where we were.
Yeah,
sorry,
that's okay.
Yeah, okay.
But you explore not only the relationship of history and fiction, but also fiction's effect on history. And that's sort of the way you structure Trust. Trust is 4 books by 4 different authors. It begins with a novel, followed by a memoir draft of the quote-unquote real person who was portrayed in the novel but wants to set the record straight, and then a memoir, and finally a diary. This isn't exactly a book of frame narratives, but because some of these 4 books live inside or partially inside the other books, that they're partially nested, and also because we have 4 different authors, we are always aware of the book as a whole, as a constructed thing. Even though you're not a voice, there's no authorial narrative voice. We're very aware of you, the creator, I think, in your absence. I would like to spend some time with this. I'm
sad to hear that.
You're sad to hear that?
I wanted to vanish.
But you do. I guess that goes back, and this is a paradox, because I feel like each of the books is immersive, but thinking of the books together, the 4 books, you can't help but think of the questions of why are these 4 books next to each other the way they are. And that's where I wanted to talk about frames and your interest in frames, because I think they create a lot of generative paradoxes like the one we've just discussed or touched on just now. For instance, people may notice that we haven't really talked about the plot of your book yet. And in fact, I want to spend time actually setting up frames outside the book first. Some psychological frames, but also some historical and philosophical frames. So I want to move farther and farther away from your book in a certain sense. But I also think weirdly by framing your book and then framing that frame, that in a way we will be moving closer to what your book is about. So in the most abstract sense, talk to us about narrative frames, either in relationship to this question of trust or not. But frames are very present in your writing in both of your books and also in some of your writing outside of your books.
Thank you for inviting me to speak about frames in an abstract sense. That's always a good way for me to start. I'm very fascinated with frames because it's a way that literature has to construct its own referential context and free itself from the supposed obligation to interact or mimic or reflect a referential reality. This is what draws me to framed narratives. And again, it's not that I set out to, I'm going to write a frame. It happens to me. It's just the way the literary part of my brain works is it's just drawn to that device, to call it somehow. So what I like about it then, it's that it emphasizes sort of the autonomy of literature, how it can become a self-contained, self-sufficient sort of realm, and even to the point of creating its own outside. This is what to me is so wondrous about frame narratives, that it's literature creating a reality for itself. How? With more literature.
It's also interesting in connection to what you said about experimental. I mean, if we think of Don Quixote as the first, as one place you could point to for the first novel, it is also very postmodern, for lack of a better word. Like it's very like aware of itself and framed, and we're reading the translation of something from another. Like it's an Arabic translation, right?
Yes.
And the second book purportedly he wrote when someone else was after the first book was continuing the story, and so he wanted to go back and continue the story, and Quixote becomes aware of his own reputation in the second book, and so the first book he's trying to create the dream, and the second book he's confronted with people who have a notion of his mythos when he didn't in the first.
Not only that, in the second part, Don Quixote also holds the first part, like he reads the first part about himself.
Yeah.
And this is prompted because I think in 1610 there was an apocryphal continuation of the novel penned by one I think Avellaneda. It's to this day it's not known who that was. So then Cervantes went and wrote the second part two, which is not unlike Trust in a way, just to undo this apocryphal continuation of his book. And yes, indeed, you have the main character reading about himself in what potentially could become like a Mobius strip. Like if he keeps reading long enough, he will get to the point where he is reading that he's reading that he's reading.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, Don Quixote is a big presence in my life, and a very important book to me. But in this case, I feel that the frame narratives, and perhaps now we can go back to the question you asked about trust and the emotional dimension of trust. The frame narratives serve not only just sort of a plot purpose, because I feel some of the big reveals in the book have to do with who is speaking, and when we thought that maybe perhaps someone else was speaking, and how these four parts, as you said, interact with each other. So the I think part of the reward of reading this book has to do with playing with those shifting frames. It's not strictly speaking a framed narrative, but it plays with reference and in ways that resembles frame narratives. But what I was saying, circling back, is that I feel that in this case, this device serves not only sort of a diegetical purpose of moving the story forward, but if it's not too excessive, also almost like an ethical purpose, because this is at the core of what the project was. Who has a voice and who is denied a voice. And this is why voice is, it's not just an exercise in ventriloquism or in like, it's not hopefully like a vaudeville act, like see how many impersonations I can do. It has to do rather than with with questioning, you know, who in history has been given a megaphone and who in history has been gagged. And what do we hear when we hear those amplified voices? What trust, and here we've finally arrived, what trust do we place in these voices just by mere virtue of their being amplified? It seems almost that we're preconditioned to trust a voice just because it's loud. We all do this all the time with authority, right? Whether we want to or not, or whether we feel foolish after we've done it, or it's a deep response that we humans have to respond to this rhetorical loudness and be subdued by it. So this is something that I wanted to explore, and this megaphone or this loudness, it's not something that we experience obviously in terms of volume, but it's a loudness that I see in history. Like, history relies on this kind of self-assuredness of the voice that presents these narratives as matters of historical record, when they are very often, historians tell us this all the time, when they are indeed very often simply that, narratives competing with other narratives, right?
Yeah.
So hence the voices, hence the emphasis on trust. And as you were pointing out, I do firmly believe that we as readers enter into very specific contracts when we read any kind of text. We expect a level of truth from the label on a prescription bottle that we don't expect from, I don't know, a fairy tale. And we assume that something we find in a history book to be more robustly anchored in referential accuracy than a science fiction story. So all of this was very interesting to me, and I was hoping, I was sort of aiming to invite the reader to question those assumptions that they have upon entering any kind of text. And to do so, it was of course vital to shift the frame. It was also vital to shift the voice, just to show you, you know, what kind of expectations do you walk into a novel, which is how the book begins. It begins with a novel within the novel, and then you have a sort of a real life, a powerful man telling his own story. And how do you interact with that, keeping in mind you just emerged from a novel? What are the differences you find, and so on and so forth? It sounds a little didactical, and when I put it this way, but it's hopefully not the experience when you read it.
No, not at all. Very far from it. But I'm gonna stubbornly keep us in the abstract for another couple moments. You have this incredible lecture you gave last year, the Finzi Contini lecture at the Whitney Humanities Center at Yale, that you can watch online, and it's also available to read as an essay, called The Heart of Fiction, Storytelling, Experience, and Truth. And there are many things I'd love to touch on that you address in this talk. But to begin with, I was hoping we could spend a moment with the three ways you categorize narratives: the field, the window, and the watcher. The field being the most common, I think, books that try to get you to forget that there is a frame, where you're on the field of action. And then the window being books that make you very conscious of the frame, of engaging with its own form, where you're always aware that you're reading words on a page. And then you have this third one, the watcher, which you call a hybrid form of being outside the frame and inside the frame as a character, of being a textual being and an extra literary being at the same time. I don't know if the watcher relates to trust, but I would love to hear a little bit more about the watcher, because it's the one that seems the hardest to grasp, I guess.
It is hard to grasp. I should preface this by saying it's from a preface. This tripartite distinction comes from I mentioned here Henry James's preface to the New York edition, I think in 1912, to The Portrait of a Lady, where he famously speaks about the house of fiction as a way to sort of exemplify what point of view is. So, he says the house of fiction has many windows, and outside it there's this field or a garden, and what viewer X sees from window A is not what viewer Y may see from window B. Um, so I took this distinction. To me, what was interesting about it was that there are these three main points of reference when you think about point of, and I'm very fascinated by the conundrum of point of view in fiction. It's something I think about a lot, and it shapes my writing in decisive ways. I feel that sometimes my projects take shape around certain point of view questions. I care a lot about it. I think it's a profoundly moral question for literature, because it has to do with knowledge and how it's administered, and how it has to do with power, your power as a narrator. What do you let the reader know, and when, and how? And this is why I feel like an enormous sense of betrayal when I had a certain kind of restricted point of view that then leaps into an omniscient kind of narrator just to create some kind of coup, some kind of cool reveal. That angers me very much. But going back to James, I should also say very, very quickly, I don't believe in typologies, not even this little one that I made up for this lecture. I don't think literature or art works that way. I think it's all a very happy mess. I think there aren't any rules. There shouldn't be any rules. And I think taxonomies are ultimately not productive. Having undermined myself thoroughly in this fashion, I would proceed to say that I thought of three kind of categories. First are those novels that take place on Henry James's garden. And we as readers are in the garden with the characters, and we kind of forget that we are at home reading the famous suspension of disbelief, right? We are there in the scene. We are with Napoleon's army in War and Peace. We are, whatever it is. And this is the realist novel, or what the realist novel aspires to be, and of course there's a wide spectrum of variations and exceptions, and it's just a typology to try to think of formal issues. It's not an exhaustive classification. But then if you take a step back, you may see the frame that contains the garden, right? And that means already that there are two different levels of reality, whether it's a framed narrative or not, right? You have the people out having tea in the garden, as Portrait of a Lady begins. It begins with tea time. So you have the people having tea, but then you also have the frame. You have maybe even the window, maybe even the window treatments, the curtains, and we could, if we extend this simile or this metaphor, we could say that this is also language. It's through which we see the scene, is through words, through language, through syntax, through form, right? That to me is the window. So I think that there is also a robust canon of literature that engages with that certain sense of opacity. It's like when you're looking out the window and you look more at the glass than what is outside, and you see maybe even the little bubbles or the condensation on the glass, or maybe just the glass, but the field will be out of focus because you're looking at the glass. And that to me is something beautiful when it happens in literature. It's form pausing and reflecting on itself, and ultimately the awareness of this being a verbal artifice, and encouraging that awareness, not trying to do away with it or to conceal it, which the sort of the garden narrative does its best to do, to not allow you to remember that this is. So here we see the strings, the puppet's strings, and then the third presence, as you say, is the third instance. Sorry, is the hardest to define, which is the watcher, because James says, there's a watcher, there's the window, there's the field. He doesn't phrase it this way, but these are the elements of his image, right? The strange thing here is that if the field is completely the realm of fiction, in a way that aspires to be completely kind of immediate, I don't think it ever is, but that's the aspiration. And if the frame or the window is the awareness that this is artifice, and sort of almost relishing in that awareness, the third instance has to do with almost literature turning around and facing you, the reader, looking outside the realm of literature itself. If the second instance means looking farther into literature, the second instance is that viewer almost turning around and looking outside literature. And there are very specific instances where this happens, and it's weird when it happens. I'm thinking, for instance, of Clarice Lispector in The Hour of the Star, or Muriel Sparks' first novel. David Markson, who is a favorite of mine, does it a lot. When suddenly, let's pick Markson, he mentions himself as the author is tired now, for example. The author hasn't really had a proper meal in a long time. If I say it's a hybrid presence, it's because it's clearly a textual being. David Markson, after all, is dead, for example. But there is a magnetic force, for lack of a better kind of comparison, that pulls those words toward the outside of the text. They can never leave the text. I understand this fully, but there is something in this whole maneuver, if you like, of this voice turning away from the text and back onto you who are reading. There is something there. There is a gesture there that aims impossibly, hopelessly, to bridge literature and life. And that to me is, when it works, it's incredible.
You've made me understand it. You made me understand The Watcher in a way that I didn't understand. But in preparing for today, I tried to make meaning, and I think I went like down a wrong alley, but I wonder if it's still I'm still curious about it, not because it's correct, but knowing that you'd studied with Derrida, I was just looking into his writing about frames, and he, in the book Truth in Painting, writes about literal physical frames. This is how I tried to make sense of The Watcher, and I just was curious what you think. But in Truth in Painting, he says that if you're standing in one position, the frame around a painting might seem like it's more part of the wall or part of the room or part of the furniture. And in another position where you're standing, it might feel like it's part of the art. But when some people describe deconstruction, they describe it as seeking neither to reframe art with a more truthful frame, nor to suggest an absence of a frame, but almost that the frame is in the painting, because the painting couldn't be a painting. Maybe, as you suggested earlier, it's creating the object of art. The painting is produced by the frame. But I guess I wondered if moving this sense of moving from place to place, and then the status of the frame changing with the movement. That's how that was my way of trying to figure out the Watcher. But it sounds like that's entirely different than what you're talking about.
I haven't read that Derrida in a long time. I haven't read any Derrida in a long time, and I think it's because I had to teach myself also how to write more lucidly in order to really become a proper fiction writer. And I think I got so enmeshed in that intentional abstruseness that comes with certain theory talk. When I was done because I found it, and I think Derrida would love this, rhetorically poisonous. He has this whole thing about the pharmacon, so he would be okay with my saying this. Not that I care, or not that he would care either, to be honest. But I did find that kind of register poisonous to me. I still sort of sort of do. My concern, as you were talking about the frame, I was thinking that, you know, the classic example here would be Las Meninas by Velázquez, where you have, you know, it's him painting the scene, but there is also a mirror that looks at the onlooker, you, the person looking at the painting, but you can't see what's on Velázquez's canvas within the painting. There is this whole bizarre, and, you know, Foucault has written about, everyone has written about this. What I fear is that this conversation is taking the whole image of the watcher or the onlooker. I'm a little concerned that it could all be mistaken with like a literary trompe-l'oeil, sort of a trick, a sleight of hand, and it's really, it's not a gimmick. What I'm hinting at, it's not that at all. It's it has more to do with, ultimately, with what we think of mimesis and representation as a whole, and what we think literature should do in regards to these matters, and in its relationship to reality. And I think, and this is at the core of trust, I think, for too long we have been wondering about how literature can adequately imitate reality. This is the question. I mean, at least since Plato, right? And this is why he expelled the poets from his ideal republic, because if we're in a world in which every object that you see is a flawed replica of an idea, right? So the chair or the table is just a fake of the ideal tableness or chairness. So then why, Socrates says, why would you add yet another layer? And look how interesting, we're back into layers and tiers. Why would you add another layer of fakeness to the already existing fakeness? So you have the ideal table, which is inaccessible. Right. Then you have the tangible table, which is fake because it's a derivative realization of that idea. And then in addition to that, you have the poets or the painters table, right? He speaks specifically of poets, which is the fake of a fake. So for too long, again, I think we've been wondering about these things, about how literature can adequately represent reality. And I think it's obviously a massively important question, and we're not done. We will never be done asking ourselves that. But with trust in particular, I tried to flip the question and try to think about how literature may affect reality, how literature may shape reality, the reality around us, because I think it does. And I think, going back to framed narratives, I think that is a very graspable example of literature creating a reality for itself. That is what a framed narrative is. Yeah. It's literature creating a reality for itself. And I think this can easily be extrapolated to a much larger sense, and with deeper implications, and to our experience out in the world. And I think it's a truism to say that our worldview is shaped by narratives. It's totally obvious. I don't think it demands proof of or evidence of any kind. Yet I think there is more work to be done in that regard. Not to conceive of literature as some mere sort of epiphenomenal froth of this real substance, but rather the reverse. How is what we have come to call reality really shaped by the stories we tell daily, and that we choose to trust, not to like
Yeah.
plug the book in any way, but it's like the
No,
pertinent way to say it. Yeah.
I feel like we're right on the edge of, I want to spend some time with the way fiction affects reality. But just before we do, I mean, you've already talked about what you talked about, and also in the essay that I reference about what you call the referential fetish of fiction, and it's insecurity about itself. It's either all imagination and thus useless and irrelevant, or it
Yeah.
is relevant because of its utility. But you suggest that it has a very significant and enduring relationship to the truth, but that it's just an entirely different one. So it's not like you're saying, well, fiction isn't related to the truth. You're saying it has a different one. And I wondered if you could speak to that just for a moment before we get into the details of Trust the Novel. Like how would you say, I mean, you quote other people who sort of touch on this too, like you quote Le Guin's Left Hand of Darkness introduction, and but
Oh yeah.
but you're suggesting that there is something that fiction does.
Let me put it this way, and let's think of history again, because I think it's a pertinent example here. Um, as we said a while ago, we've been shown, and we are shown repeatedly, that history is very often an ideological construct, and we have been taught to have a productive distrust, or to revise it constantly, which I think is a very necessary exercise that we should all engage in. Yet, when you put history and fiction together, it seems that obviously most of us would say, well, history is the one that is sort of closer to uh, truth, or has a tighter relationship to it, whereas fiction is make believe, harmless play. Yet, as we just said, history is the object of constant revision. And literature, on the other hand, over the last, whatever, almost 3 millennia in the West, which is the only thing I can speak to more or less, right? I think has provided a pretty solid record of what it means to be a human being on planet Earth. It has come pretty close to at least a sliver of truth of what the human experience is, regardless of our definition of truth is it changes all the time, it shifts, but I, for one, if I were to look for that, I would go first to fiction, and second to other supposedly more fact-based discourses. So I think this is one way in which fiction is tied to truth, and often overlooked and sort of shunned and pushed aside as some sort of mere entertainment, or perhaps fables with some sort of pedagogical purpose. But I think that again, over and over, literature has been able to show us to some extent what love, what loss, what grief and rage and disorientation and guilt feel like, and I stress also feel, which is and the emotional dimension is usually excluded from the pursuit of truth. And I think that's a terrible mistake. so again, I think that literature has a pretty decent track record of showing what our experience on Earth is like, and that's why we go back to
Yeah.
these texts,
Yeah.
and it's paired. And I should say this because it's also important, just as emotion is important. I think the aesthetic dimension, the sheer pleasure, the aesthetic experience we get from reading, is something we can't obtain from any other form of experience. And I think therein lies the value of literature, in that it provides us with uh, an experience itself of truth, of beauty, uh, and I don't think any other art form can do that in the way that literature does it, because I think the prime material of literature, and this is something that I mentioned in that essay that you referenced, the prime material of literature is meaning. Uh, right? I mean, if you're a painter, you have color. If you're a musician, you have sound. If you're a filmmaker, you have light, and you have costumes. You have in literature, what you're ultimately working with is meaning. Mm-hmm. And this is why I feel that literature is, strictly speaking, so meaningful.
Yeah. Well, thank you for your patience with me in sort of staying and circling around trust for so long, because I want to spend some time now with trust itself. If we think of this question that you've mentioned about how fiction influences history, how fiction influences life, that's not just a subject of trust. It's also enacted in trust, because the book begins with the first book in the 4-book set is the only ostensibly fictional book of the 4, the standalone novel called Bonds, that as your novel progresses, greatly
I would quibble with that, but
no,
okay.
no, so would I. I would,
yeah, okay,
yeah, but
all right.
It's the book that calls itself. Let's say it is the book that calls itself fiction, and that fiction greatly influences the so-called non-fictional 3 books that follow it, even though that author is never in the book. So talk to us about this novel, Bonds, in its own right, but also in light of your interest in fiction as an actor in the world at large, how Bonds, in a way, creates real, quote unquote, real narrative inside of your book.
Yeah. Bonds was a joy to write. It's the first book of the 4 books that compose the entire novel that I wrote, and it contains the whole story, albeit in a very distorted fashion and full of gaps and lacunae and inaccuracies, which I would sort of take note of in order to correct them or fill the blanks in later sections of the novel. It is written in this slightly decadent tone. It's a novel written in the mid-30s, but it sounds a little bit earlier. It sounds like a turn of the century voice, and I wanted this outdatedness. I wanted it because to my mind, it worked that the author would be slightly decadent, and I don't know, I just felt like writing like that. A lot of it happens that way too. And you rightly said that the fictional author of this novel, whose name is Harold Vanner, I looked for names forever and I couldn't find a good name. I wrote part of it. I was in New England when I was writing this, and I would go to these little cemeteries in these small towns and look at tombstones, looking for good kind of New England names. I couldn't find any, so I just made it up. Harold Vanner. Vanner is not a real name, but it sounded right. And what I love about Harold Vanner is that he never appears in the book, as you just said. I mean, the whole book happens because of him, because he writes this novel called Bonds, and people in real life, quote unquote, react to it, and it sets the whole plot in motion. And there were sort of in notes that I took toward the novel, I had I had him appear. I had Ida, the secretary who is the narrator of the third part, look him up in he would live in Long Island someplace, and she would go and find him, and they would meet. But then I really liked the idea of him being this one of the great protagonists of the book, and never really and not having a body in the book. And speaking of bodies, I think that this first part, Bonds, is very disembodied as a narrative, and that is very intentional. The tone is very kind of hovering. It's very removed. It's at an arm's length at most of the time. Sometimes it closes in a little bit, but there are no physical descriptions in that part. And that was a conversation with my editor, like, hey, no physical descriptions. I said, I'm well aware of that. There's no dialogue except for one line, because I wanted to create this utter sense of removal and a world, again, that almost had no bodies, that were just the ideas of these characters. And the progression, and the novel makes a very pronounced progression until in the end we are very much inside a body that is furthermore in pain, and we're inside a mind. And so we start from a great height in a way, and then we really descend into physicality and selfhood in a way that we are intentionally deprived of in the first book.
So when you say the novel progresses, you mean your novel, not Harold Vanner's novel?
No, thank you for the distinction. No, Trust, not Bonds. No, Bonds, the Harold Vanner novel, remains in this kind of hovering place. Yeah, very much intentionally.
Well, one of the things I really enjoyed when you were touring for your debut was how you wanted to place yourself in a long tradition of writers who wrote about the West, but actually didn't know anything about it or very little about it. And you were citing like Puccini's Western opera and Brecht's opera and Borges's stories about American outlaws, and also, of course, spaghetti Westerns in film. And none of them are really going for representational reality. It's the facts are often wrong, but it's sort of beside the point, as long as they sort of get a little bit of the decorative aspect correct. But you also note that America welcomed these stories and worked them into the myth of the West, that even America itself, it was beside the point to America, the representational aspect, as long as could be used in a way to sort of self-valorize. And you suggest that this foreignness is part of the Western genre in sort of this weird way. And you even point to where the first Western might actually be foreign, that it was embedded in an early Sherlock Holmes crime procedural. And so the first Western
That's my pet theory.
Yeah, that the first Western might not actually be an American narrative, which weirdly might make it more of an American narrative.
Totally.
But I guess I wanted to talk about foreignness as it plays a role in the American myth of capital, or whether it plays a role, because there's definitely foreignness in the book. We have the wife of the industrialists, mental health deterioration, and they go to a Swiss sanatorium. The ghostwriter comes from a family of Italian immigrant anarchists.
Yes.
Immigration and otherness are always sort of at the margins of this story, no matter how hermetic the narrative around capital tries to be. So I wondered if you could talk about foreignness in Trust and whether it has a similar paradoxical relationship to the real as you suggested with the Western, that to engage with the myth of capital, you need to know a little about it in an embodied way on the ground, the way that you don't need to know much about the West to write about the West. Is there an element of is that element of foreignness to you essential to what you're writing about, as you write about America in New York and this family of one of the wealthiest families in the world?
So I believe your question was somewhat two-faced in a way. First, you mentioned how I made it a point to single out the writers who had uh, addressed the American West without ever having been there, and I put myself in that in that little tradition myself, because I made it a point not to go to these places when I was writing about it, because looping back to our previous conversation, I think that literature is free from those, or ought to be free from those constraints, and there's the work of the imagination that I'm very protective of. I don't want to straitjacket it with factual overload. Um, and I think that kind of removal from the topic also applied to trust, because I don't, as you said, I come from sort of a PhD in the humanities. I'm not, I don't have any background in finance at all. So I had to teach myself what was uh, how this world worked. And actually, come to think of it now, speaking with you, it wasn't as different as the Western, in as much as so many writers create the illusion of the West just by dropping certain kind of lexical tchotchkes, or by resorting to certain like contextual cliches. You can just as easily, you could do that with money. If you know which terms to mention that seem to be written in sort of some kind of financial lingo, it's easy enough, I think, to create a superficial illusion of the fact that you're representing somewhat accurately this world. I didn't do exactly that with trust. What I did discover, though, was, as I read about monetary policy, financial instruments, history of the markets, and so on and so forth, was that this discourse was intentionally abstruse. There's this American economist called Paul Romer. He's a Nobel laureate in economics, and one of his papers is about this term he coined that is called mathiness. And what he points out in this paper, which I could follow only up to a point, because it does get very technical very fast. But the main premise is that, of course, there are certain aspects of economics that are deeply embedded in mathematics. Nobody can deny that would be absurd. But it's equally true that some aspects of finance and economic theory are a matter of consensus, right? Of politics, policy, and debate, right? And there's certain economists who sort of envelop their arguments in this mathiness, in this sort of fake mathematical tone, to give it the aura of objectivity, thus bypassing the consensus moment, and presenting this as an idea that can only be legitimate after a discussion. You can bypass this by suggesting or pretending that all of this is framed by some kind of mathematical argument. I learned about this term mathiness after writing my novel, but I experienced mathiness as I was reading for the novel all the time. And that to me was a very interesting thing, because it's so obviously a power play. It's by design, the effect is to make people like you or me think that we can't, this is all beyond our grasp, that we couldn't possibly understand it, and we should leave it in the hands of the specialists. And this is what I tried to do with the second book in the novel, the autobiography of the tycoon. It's a short section. It's one of the shortest sections in the book, but I really wanted to try the reader's patience a little bit with this, because this is what is done to us on a daily basis.
Yeah.
With financial reports, with with the stuff we get from our credit cards, down to, if you read the financial section of the New York Times, anything that involves money is meant to be incomprehensible. And
Yeah.
we've all experienced this. I don't need to dwell on this. And I wanted to explore sort of the this rhetoric a little bit, and what it does to the reader, how it you're supposed to feel a little bit worn down by it.
But there's also this other element, I think, too, which I loved, is the tone just feels really off. Like the sense of the person speaking is really, I don't know how I want to use a word like icky, but it's like
It is icky.
There's something really off about this personality that you can't put your finger on. And yet he's delivering this information. So there is another thing happening other than just trying the patience around the lexicon. For sure.
No,
There's
course.
this other sort of like emotional valence where you're like, where is this coming from?
Many other things happen, and it also implies a reveal. You sort of gave it away a moment ago, but if it went by unnoticed, I won't highlight it again. But there is a reason why all this feels the way that it does, like so overblown, so icky, to quote you, and so like almost Trumpianly over the top. This he's so there is this he's so man-spreading in his tone, in a way that, of course, is completely intentional. I had the happy idea. I think it was a happy idea because I was writing this section, and it was hard because it's this voice that but I took this section and sort of shattered it. Literally, the section is shattered, and when you read it, it becomes fragmentary. It's full of what seemingly are notes to self, and they're blank pages, and I think that I was hoping to give that section sort of a formal edge. Going back to experimental literature, I was trying to give it a formal edge, and there's a jolt that I'm just ruining now by saying it. Like the first time you encounter this, and you go, like I sent the novel to my agent, and my agent was he was laughing. Of course, he said, well, I got to the second part and was like, I thought you had left a note to yourself in the manuscript. And then it was like, oh, of course, no. I mean, very very quickly it becomes obvious what's going on. But so that is what I was trying to do. Also, I feel that I was hoping to amass this kind of capital with the reader in the first section, and then blow through it in the second part, and then rebuild it in the third and fourth.
I think
part.
You really do it. It feels like this grand success, Hernan, to me. I mean, I do feel like you build up something and then you pull the rug out, but then build it up again, but not with the same person building it up.
That was the plan. The plan, and it's a gamble. I know. Perhaps some readers will, I don't know. It will. I don't know if it will work for everyone, but what does? So that's okay.
Before I ask another question, why don't you just touch on the relevance or irrelevance of these sort of foreign things on the margins of the story?
Well, I think foreignness is essential both to me. I'm a foreigner wherever I go, and I have a bit of an accent in whichever language I speak. So foreignness is important to me, and it's essential to what people call the American experience. Obviously, so I don't think you can talk about any kind of historical moment in the United States, whether it be the West or the consolidation of the United States as a financial empire, without also touching upon immigration. The way in which I try to write about this is sort of at least like threefold, and you mentioned this before. One is I try to highlight that the protagonist himself, or the male protagonist, I should say, this tycoon, is an immigrant. Right, his parents had this whole itinerary in Europe, from Scandinavia to Scotland to the United States, and early on they come here in the 18th century. But we have a tendency to forget that those people were immigrants as well. We have a tendency to forget that Vanderbilt was an immigrant. You know what I'm saying? And he was. It's just a term we reserve for other people. So that to me was important, and that's actually how the book begins, by stressing that. So that's one of the ways in which immigration appears. The second way, you alluded to it, and I'm grateful because nobody up till now had picked up on this, is just the Americans abroad, which is of course a very Jamesian thing, but I think it's something that has marked the literature of this country so deeply, that I wanted to do something with that as well, with the Americans abroad. And in this case, most of the action takes place in Switzerland, but there are some scenes that I really like in the book that take place in Italy, for example. So that's the second sort of a reverse or an emigration, if you like. And the third and most important aspect is that the longest section in the book, which is the third section, written by a woman called Ida Partenza, very much hinges on immigration. Ida Partenza is the daughter of an Italian anarchist who migrated to Brooklyn around, in the early 19, before the Great War. And it was shocking, the more I read for this book, the more I discovered the disparity, on either side of the river, of the East River. On one side, you had a world of complete excess and luxury. And on the other side, there was like blood traction. Literally, there is these beautiful photographs taken by Berenice Abbott, a photographer I love from the 30s, and you see these same year, different side of the river, and it's in one you're in a, it's sort of a jazz age extravaganza, and in the other one you're in a small town in Sicily with malnourished children. It's all in New York, minutes away from each other. So this was something I really wanted to think about. Also, I'm half Italian, so that is a meaningful thing to me. My family just as easily could have ended up in New York. My great grandparents, they just happened to go to Argentina, but and within that, the history of Italian American anarchists of the time is also fascinating to me. And I think the most fascinating thing is the degree to which there are almost no records of their presence during those, almost 4 decades in New York. And that rose a lot of questions for me. So yes, definitely foreignness is a crucial aspect. And I should also point out, as I was writing this, right, it was during the Trump administration. The bulk of the book was written during the Trump administration, and I was learning about the sort of the Republican administrations of the 20s, mostly Harding and Coolidge. Harding, who ran under the slogan "America First," and Coolidge, who in 24 enacted the sort of Immigration Quota Act that restricted immigration from very specific regions. Like if you were German, everything was okay, but if you were Asian or Italian, you couldn't get in anymore. And this was at the time where very similar things were happening in the United States. In every day I could see them in the newspapers. So it was really eye-opening to me to see how steadfast and absolutely coherent and cohesive the Republican agenda has been for over a century. Like they haven't moved an inch. they stand for exactly the same things they did 100 years ago, exactly the same things. And you can see this very clearly in their immigration policies, and in, not to talk about their economic policies as well, which are also seemingly impervious to reality change. And yeah.
And the anarchist father in this book, is he connected at all to your own father in some way? I know that your family left Argentina for Sweden partially or maybe fully because of their less leftist activity when the coup happened.
Yeah, no, fully. Yeah, for sure. I grew up in a very political household, and my father mainly was uh, active in his youth.
Yeah.
Then he became a little more comfortable and bourgeois as time went on. But yes, I thought about him a lot as I was writing this part of the book.
One other way I wanted to connect the way fiction affects history and perhaps your history is with Borges, and not the Borges that I think most Americans know, the Borges of nested
Yeah.
realities and fractal structures, but the Borges that you juxtapose with him that examines and engages with literary history. That's mostly the Borges where that it gets erased when he travels as a figure in the world. When I was reading your book, I had no idea how, until I read it, just how much he's engaged with the United States, the literature of the United States, the mythology of the United States.
Isn't it crazy? I mean, I don't think it's a known fact at all.
And you say that it's hard to think of two writers that shaped Borges more than Poe and Whitman.
Yeah.
And that for Borges, modern literature stems from these two. And in his own words, he says, undeniably, all that is specifically modern and contemporary poetry comes from two North Americans of genius, Edgar Allan Poe and Walt Whitman. From Poe derive Baudelaire's symbolism, Valery, and in a way Joyce. And one might add that Poe's theory is perhaps more important and more productive than its practice. From Whitman derives the civil poetry of humanity, often called engaged. And his particular interest in Whitman is interesting to me because of just how much Whitman is engaged in extending the myth of America through art making. But when I think about like how you've described how when you're in Sweden, Argentina was this mythological place. And then you move back to Argentina and Sweden takes on sort of like the lost childhood mythology. But
Where did you find all this stuff? I'm freaking out.
Well, we have your house mic'd, but but you've also said that if it wasn't for Borges, you wouldn't be in the United States. And I don't know how much of that is an exaggeration, but it sounds to me like you're suggesting that Borges, in one regard, points you there. He points you to the United States just as much as you uncover in your book on him how much he himself is sort of facing towards it.
Yeah, it's a good question how hyperbolic I may have been in this obscure document that you extracted from who knows where. I'm very impressed by your archival work here. It's terrifying but impressive. It may be hyperbole, but it may also be totally accurate. I got to know American literature through Borges. This is not a made up thing. This is totally true. I would read. I can show you. I still have the same copy of his collected works, and I would read it and understand a very small percentage of what I was reading. I was a teenager and trying to figure it out. But I was very intrigued and interested by especially his take on these North American authors, many of whom I didn't know. And it's a little embarrassing to admit that this face pre-exists Google. Like it really dates me very in a in a very sad way, but it's true. And this is also a true story. So I would jot down the names that I was interested in, and then go to the National Library and look them up. And to my embarrassment, like a good percentage of those names were totally made up and were weren't available. So it was that was also an education in talk about frames and literature bleeding into reality. Like that was a very beautiful way of experiencing that as a kid, you know. But yes, I feel I read Poe thanks to him first in the Julio Cortázar translation. So that is a nice trifecta right there.
Mm-hmm.
I definitely read Henry James for the first time thanks to him. I can say the same thing about Hawthorne and Emerson. I mean, Borges was also very, I think he was very conservative when it came to American literature. He, uh, Nabokov famously despised everyone. Remember that when they asked him, "What's your view of contemporary literature?" and he said, the view is great from up here." You know,
Oh wow.
yeah, and he hated everyone, but he loved Borges. But Borges hated everyone, including Nabokov. He disliked, so, and he loved detective fiction, but he didn't like sort of hard boiled, like he was not into Chandler, Hammett, Ross MacDonald, any of that was not his thing. So I think for him, American literature stops maybe between the wars, if you know. Um, but yes, definitely Borges was my entryway into American literature, but also, his fingerprints are all over trust, in the sense that I think it's ultimately from him that I learned how to play, say, with genre, and it's from him that I learned how to think about shifting frames and play with different sort of invented contexts. And I'm thinking now as I speak of this beautiful story called Clun Ukbar Orbis Tertius,
Mm-hmm.
where there is this false encyclopedia circulating around the world in a very limited edition about this made up planet. But toward the end of the story, objects from this planet that are not like in the periodic table of elements, so definitely alien objects, start popping up in the real world. So sort of fiction effectively invading and taking over the real world, just as that famous parable that he wrote about the society of cartographers who, in their attempt of making a totally accurate map, made a map the size of the empire that covered the empire, yes, inch by inch. These are notions that I think that trust engages with.
Forgive me for asking the one last terrifyingly archival question about you.
Oh no!
When I had the poet Ray Armantrout on, she talked about how she's often trying to create a quote unquote truth effect, an effect that with further thought is discovered to have a false bottom, and that there are certain patterns of syntax or ways to match sound with rhythm that can create the effect that a statement is true. And she isn't just doing this as a linguistic device or as a form of play, but as a way to examine the ways language can manipulate us. You've also talked about how frames can create a truth effect, that we are predisposed to think of the outer frame, the one that's closest to us, as being real or more real. That when Håkan and in the distance begins the story around a fire, and then we don't return to the fire until the end of the book. We're returning to a place that we confer a sense of greater authenticity to. And you described this as surrounding narrative, as you've mentioned also here, surrounding narrative with narrative, of cutting off the isthmus between a story and us and sort of creating an island. And I guess I wanted to ask you about this because I'm really curious about you and islands, I guess, as you have academic,
oh my God.
You have academic work with titles like Figures of Confinement, Literature and Claustrophilia, and Archipelago, Figures of Isolation in Modern Transatlantic Literature. You have a essay from 2010 on islands, Topical Paradise, or even when you were celebrating at an event Tove Jansson's work, you said isolation was a formal component of her work and that her work was more like an archipelago rather than most novels, which are more like continents. So I guess I wondered about islands and archipelagos.
Oh dear.
In relationship, I mean, you persuasively talk about them in relationship to truth and truth effects by creating this framing. But I think of like also the main character in your first book has no one to speak to. He is an island moving across America. And you mentioned at the beginning, you opened this conversation with me about isolation, and the way capital accumulation paradoxically might imprison people through its accumulation. But what is this? What is this through? What seems like a through line? Academic, literary, perhaps emotional, about archipelagos and islands versus continents.
Yeah, I'm now genuinely sort of paranoid about the extent of like how did you fish all this up? I don't know. But thank you, and I'm sorry that you had to spend the time doing it. And but it's true. It's true. I started I developed like when I was in grad school, and how appalling all those titles are should give you a notion of how dreadful those pieces are as well. But I developed this interest for islands, uh, and the way they're represented in literature. And I think at the time maybe I didn't know exactly why, and only now, over a decade or a decade and yeah later, can I see why this was so interesting to me. Let's do it this way. I think the most famous island narrative there is Utopia, even if relatively few people may have read it, but it's such a part of our vocabulary. This utopia, as a which means literally a no place, but as an idyllic, ideal configuration. And I was interested in how literature itself could become sort of an utopian configuration by, again, quoting me, by sort of severing the isthmus that connects it to the mainland of referential reality. And we have been circling around this topic since the beginning of our conversation. And I'm interested in how literature can become completely autonomous. And since we're talking about my academic years, I should also mention here, I was heavily invested in Adorno, who is someone actually who I keep rereading now and then, and remains very relevant to me, especially in his aesthetic theory. He makes a very strong case for aesthetic autonomy and the autonomy of the artistic sphere, which is something that interests me because it ultimately leads to artistic freedom, which is what I'm looking for. And any lack of restraints and dogmas or ideological kind of determinations, and a self-reliance in self-imposed yet necessary rules, And I found all of this to be enacted and represented in a very literal, or rather literalized, in literature about islands, And I read a bunch of these narratives. It's no sheer coincidence. Also, Campanella has his utopia on an island. So does Francis Bacon. Perkins Gilman in Herland, I think it's an island as well. I'm not sure about that one. Samuel Butler has a utopic island. The list goes on and on and on. So there is something about isolation and this kind of Eden-like setting that go hand in hand. And I think, I guess I was interested in this in this simultaneously negative and affirmative gesture that goes into isolation. Negative because, of course, you're severing yourself away from a larger set, but affirmative because in that negation you're also creating this other space. I very much doubt that any of what I just said made sense as I was talking. You know when you're talking and you're saying the words, but your brain is also kind of scanning your brain, thinking, what is it that I wrote about this? What is it that I have to say about it now? Like it was a very meta thing going on in my head as I spoke. So please delete all of this. It's most likely garbage. But thank you for fishing it up and making me think about it again.
Well, I picked two really brief excerpts that I was hoping you'd read that just are examples of the ways you drop in some of these questions, like say around framing into story. So one is the opening paragraph of the second book about New York City. I was hoping you'd read that for us because I love that one. And so this is the beginning of the second book, which is written by the industrialist who feels like he was unfairly portrayed in the first book.
I am a financier in a city ruled by financiers. My father was a financier in a city ruled by industrialists. His father was a financier in a city ruled by merchants. His father was a financier in a city ruled by a tight-knit society, indolent and priggish, like most provincial aristocracies. These four cities are one and the same. New York.
And I was hoping maybe we could follow that with the first two paragraphs on page 83, which is from the first book. So this is the fictionalized wife of the industrialist. In this book, she's called Helen, and she's discussing the deterioration of her mental state, but it also feels like it evokes this sort of fractal framing in a different way.
Oh, beautiful, beautiful selection. I mean, I've never read this out loud except for when I was working on it because I read stuff to myself. But okay. She could feel herself think differently and knew that in the end, it did not matter whether this feeling was based on reality or fantasies. What mattered was that she was enabled to stop thinking about her thoughts. Her speculations reflected one another like parallel mirrors, and endlessly, each image inside the vertiginous tunnel looked at the next, wondering whether it was the original or a reproduction. This, she told herself, was the beginning of madness, the mind becoming the flesh for its own teeth. Because she felt increasingly lost in the new tyrannical architecture of her brain, and because she no longer trusted her thoughts or her memory, she started relying on her journals, which she kept with daily rigor. She hoped her future self, the one reading her diaries, would be able to use those writings as a measure of how far into her delirium she had gone. Would she see herself on the page? She addressed herself constantly in her entries, asking herself to believe that it was, in fact, she who had written those words in the past, even if her future self refused to believe it, even if, as she read, she were unable to recognize her own handwriting.
We've been listening to Hernan Diaz read from his latest book, Trust. I'd like to spend the rest of the time with voice. To me, the heart of the book, even though we've spent so much time on form, is really voice. Also, I think voice is what's most miraculous to me about Trust, that we start in the style of Edith Wharton or Henry James, and by the end of your novel, we're in something that's more like Jean Rhys or Virginia Woolf, that your syntax changes from chapter to chapter. And that you actually developed the style guide that sat along each of these chapters. And I'd be curious to hear about any specific constraints you might have set yourself in each of those chapters. But before we hear that, I know you were recently in conversation with two past Between the Covers guests, Alejandro Zambra and Mark Haber, who both have new books out, Chilean Poet and Saint Sebastian's Abyss, respectively. So when I had Mark on for his debut book, we talked a lot about voice because people were marveling at how Reinhardt's Garden felt like it was written by a Latin American writer, that he had somehow inhabited the terms of that literary universe in some way while also remaining very much Mark Haber at the same time. Also, as an aside, his enthusiasm for the work of Fernanda Melchor is largely the reason she came on the show. But in the spirit of voice, I wanted to play a question from Mark to you, thinking about the ways, at least I'm thinking about the ways you've created these style guides. You've I think convincingly moved from book to book and inhabited these different voices so well. This is Mark's question for you.
Hi, David. Hey, Hernan. This is Mark Haber. Congratulations, Hernan, on all your success with The Trust. It's so well deserved. It's just, it's a feat. It's a magnificent novel. So I had a question that occurred to me after you'd left Houston. Being a monolingual writer as I am, I only know English. Does your rich background in different languages, Spanish and Swedish and English, does that inform your writing in any way? Thanks a lot.
What a lovely question, and how lovely to hear Mark's voice. I love Mark Haber so much, and his work is so beautiful. And that's a lovely question. So at home we spoke Spanish, but out in the world, my first social tongue was Swedish. I never studied English formally. I feel I got it almost as a gift, only by virtue of knowing Swedish. And it's not uncommon that people who have Swedish will somewhat spontaneously get English, and I feel I was one of them. I just started reading novels with a dictionary. That's really how I taught myself. And then of course I moved to English speaking countries. But except for my childhood sort of forays into terrible short story writing and even worse poetry, I've never written seriously fiction in any other language than English. And to respond directly to Mark's question, yes, being coming from other languages and having other languages has definitely informed my writing in English. The reason why I write in English is love. I love this language there, and it's unexplainable as love. I feel I can do and say things that I can't in other languages. It has a texture that I like. It's like asking a sculptor, why do you work with wood instead of with marble? And it will most likely, I don't know the first thing about sculpture, but I would imagine it's some sort of connection between the material and the hand. And that's very much how I feel about the English language. And I can't explain it any better than this. What I can say with just a smidge more of eloquence is that there are several things that intellectually I like about English. I like what English syntax is able to do, which is very specific, and it would take probably a bit of time. I like how prepositions can change the meaning of words in ways that they can't, say, in Romance languages. That is very beautiful to me. I love that it has sort of a Germanic Saxon keyboard register and then a sort of a Romance Latin register. How you can express both of those things, and that is actually something that I thought about for Trust. Andrew Bevel doesn't use many sort of Latinate words. That was something that I was thinking about as I was writing it. That's a quick example. I suppose also because it is an acquired language, there is a degree of attention that to me is very productive. There is a certain distance that to me is very productive as well. There is a velocity to it in my head that I also find very productive. So I think these are some of the reasons why I write in English, and how it being a foreign language has shaped my style. I can't imagine myself, no, nor do I want to, writing in any other language. And going back to that Borges story that you quoted me saying in some obscure source that he was the reason why I had moved to the United States. This may or may not be true, but what is 100% true is that I moved to the United States and England because I wanted to live in English. That this is the primary, like, academia was, I didn't have a penny, so it was the way in which I could make it happen, through grants and such. But the primary reason was that I wanted to live a life in English, and and that's why I'm still here. So, yeah.
So in contrast to you saying you are not interested in mimesis or the referential aspects of fiction, you do seem very interested in it when it comes to nonfiction, of pulling back the curtain on just how much nonfiction has far less of a representational relationship to the truth or to reality than it claims to have. For instance, as you mentioned earlier, you revive an era when anarchism was robust in the United States as a movement, in the sense that there were over 500 anarchist periodicals that existed between 1870 and 1940.
Yes.
And that history has been erased in real life, not because it wasn't true, but because it was either an inconvenient truth or incompatible with the myth-making that was happening around America. But you also do this on the level of language. The second book in Trust, called My Life, immediately is staking a claim with that title to a certain truth. And the my in it is suggesting that, in contrast to the novel that precedes it, that this is coming from an authority. And as I mentioned earlier, the second book feels the most off. And it's also this book with its draft, for instance, where instead of a short, dignified account of Mildred's rapid mental decline, we find the placeholder words, short, dignified account. So we already know that there's a certain agenda to what the scene is going to be created, or they're more concerned about the effect of the scene than the truth of the scene, perhaps. That we're seeing here how voice is constructed. But because the memoirist has hired a ghostwriter, and when the ghostwriter records how he speaks in a faithful way and then reads it back to him, and he's very dissatisfied because he doesn't feel like there's enough gravitas or grandeur in the portrayal, he isn't self-aware enough to see that he lacks those qualities, that she's actually showing him himself, but instead is sort of asking for her to create a better voice, or a voice of how he would imagine himself. And she does this by reading and collecting other voices, kind of the way you're doing that. She creates this Frankenstein voice, though, a unified voice coming from many voices. But even if there weren't a ghostwriter, I think you're pointing at something about nonfiction and also about history. I think any memoirist wants to be seen in a certain way, or see themselves, or can only see themselves in a certain limited way that they can't see around, let alone questions of memory and its fallibility. And I wonder if we could just spend a moment around this question of the Frankenstein voice, or more generally of the fictional nature of nonfiction, the inevitable fictional nature of nonfiction, as you construct Ida's voice, which is Bevel's voice.
Yeah, I should preface this by saying, there's so many colleagues who are nonfiction writers who have thought about this form of writing very seriously and intelligently. And I am purely a fiction writer, and my nonfiction is imagined, and so whatever I say comes from this kind of place of enunciation. I am not a nonfiction writer. I am just I am just toying here with the border between non and fiction. That is what interests me. So I'm not questioning or indicting nonfiction as a genre for which I have an enormous respect. I feel it's important to clarify this. Perhaps one of the crucial purposes of the novel, or one of the reasons that drove me to write the book to begin with, was to explore how movable and evanescent the border between fact and fiction is in the realm of writing, right? And as we discussed before, how writing can actually, in a weird feedback, have an effect on reality and almost to eternity, if you like. So this is something that concerns me a lot, and I think it also ties in with the watcher whom we were talking about, who is this liminal textual presence who is on the border, inhabits the border between literature and life. So this is something that concerns me, and even ties back to the islands, perhaps. What I was trying to do in this second section is, first, and this is a massive spoiler, so maybe skip ahead for 2 minutes if you haven't read the book right now. But what I was trying to do is first to present this extremely almost intolerable voice, because it's so masculine, it's so blustery, it's so aggressive, it has no self-doubt whatsoever, only an absolute certainty that it deserves to be heard. This is the kind of voice that we're given. And not to worry, it's only just like 30 pages or so, but that is the voice. And I wanted, hopefully, to elicit certain feelings in or from the reader. And then the reveal, and this is the spoiler, is that it was indeed a woman impersonating this kind of, or assuming this voice. And this goes to show both how, again, the voice of women so often are squashed underneath these sort of heavy masculine voices that take up all the space. Literally, in this case, Ida's voice vanishes under this masculine voice she has created for her employer. And I also wanted to highlight the fact, and I think we've discussed this before, how this sense of authority and gravitas, to use the word that you just used a moment ago, are fictive, are the result of rhetorical operations. And it occurred to me that it would be a nice idea to have Ida, instead, because she's a young woman from Brooklyn, self-taught. She has had no access to this world of privilege ever until she got this job. So to me, it was a good idea, which I then gave Ida herself. A lot of my research and a lot of my process I gave to Ida. Like, for instance, all the stuff that you see her doing at libraries is stuff that I did at archives, or sources that I consulted, I have her consulting, and so on and so forth. So there is a very kind of meta thing there, where I gave her my actual research. But I thought it would be a good idea for a character like this, who, as I was saying, is self-taught, from the quote unquote wrong side of the river, to look to history in order to complete this task. And what she does effectively, and this is what the novel says, she creates this sort of monster, with body parts sourced from other sort of great men, in quotes, of American history. And to do this, I read mostly memoirs. I started with Benjamin Franklin, and I kind of ended with uh, Calvin Coolidge ish, kind of that era, um, just to get a sense of that tone. I didn't want anything anachronistic, uh, and uh, and I tried to distill whatever I thought was whatever made these men authoritative, whatever gave these men the luster that they hope they will have. Um, there aren't any direct quotes or anything, but I really learned. I think I got a better sense of how history is actually made, by these people, or how they hope it will be made.
Yeah, I mean, to me, as I alluded to at the beginning, to me, if I were to put forth what I think the book is about, I don't think the book is at its heart about money. At least I want to assert that it isn't. Because I think about Ida, she's not happy with how the novelist portrays the industrialist's wife, and she's not happy about how the memoirist is portraying the industrialist's wife. And yet the two documents that are going to be in the world ultimately are going to be those portrayals of the industrialist's wife, the novel and the memoir.
That's right.
The things in the book that will disappear are her views, essentially. To me, this novel is more than anything about canon formation and the erasure of women. That ultimately, this is a novel with a feminist ethos. Like, I think of the lines of Le Guin, to keep women's words, women's works alive and powerful. That's what I see as our job as writers and readers for the next 15 years and the next 50. And I feel like you've done something really amazing by dramatizing the erasure itself, revealing the mechanics of how it happens, but also peeling back and revealing the voices that will never surface, as if we're discovering a long lost recording, like a rescue from something that shouldn't even be in the archive. Because of this, I could imagine the book being set in any number of non-money settings. You could put this in at the conference that's deciding what books are going to be in the Bible or what books are not going to be in the Bible, or at a sci-fi award nomination committee. I think you could set it in a number of places and still enact a nested narrative that would be about the falsehood of the self-made man, but really about telling the story of women.
Yes, and to a small extent, no, to a lot of what you said. First, thank you. I mean, for what you said about this book having a feminist ethos and being mostly about the erasure of women. And it's not lost in me that here we are, two dudes talking about that. And that's something also that I grappled with during the writing of the novel itself, with issues of appropriation, with issues of, voice again. I thought if someone asked Colson Whitehead about this, and he said, you can write about anything you like, just don't fuck it up, and I think that's quite true. But all this to say, I think we should pause and acknowledge that fact that it happens to be two men talking about this. I think that's an important thing to state, although it's abundantly obvious. But when I was, again, thinking of all of these issues, I also thought this is what literature ought to do. It should be able to expand beyond, my little circumstances. Otherwise, literature becomes a selfie, which it kind of has to a large extent. We're not going down that rabbit hole, but I think the writing I am interested in takes this chance of trying to imagine other lives and other positions and other experiences, and that's what I try to do. And it's not just imagining any other life and any other experience. I'm particularly interested in lives and experiences that have been, to some extent, deleted from certain kinds of narratives. And here's my partial no to what you said, which is, I think it is important that it is about money in the United States and not a sci-fi convention, because be- because because money is the all organizing force in American society. I mean, in modern society as a whole, I say this without hesitation. More than any other institution, I think money is an institution. More than any other institution, it's money. But in the United States in particular, the place that money occupies is unparalleled. If you think of other countries. And again, circling back to the very beginning of our conversation, narratives around money or of money making are completely devoid of women. And so here you have the all defining instance of the American dream, because let's not fool ourselves. That's what the American dream is about, the sort of the ability to make money.
Yeah.
And even the notion of freedom, I sometimes fear may be sort of freedom of enterprise above anything else, right? And freedom to own property. So here we have this what is at the core of, again, the American dream, the American experience, however you want to phrase it. And somehow it's a world without women, like literally without women, both in history and in fiction. I mean, perhaps we can find a few exceptions, but I think overwhelmingly, I think we can agree that this is the case, and this is why money matters in that sense. And I think also money matters because money has been an important instrument in the segregation of women from social life. Their inability to earn it, their inability to own private property until relatively very recently in the United States. So money has been effectively a very important tool in the subjugation of women in the world and in this country in particular. So I do think it matters. And lastly, it matters because money, to circle back to the title of the book, money has everything to do with trust. Like, very much like language, there is a contractual dimension to money. We have all agreed that money has a certain value, that it's not inherent to it. There is no purchase power inherent to a $10 bill other than the one that is bestowed on it by virtue of our trust in a system that supports it.
So I just want to hear a little bit more about this. You've talked about how money here and in other places is a fiction. So here's an example of something with real effects in the world that is a fiction, that there's nothing material or tangible about it. Its value is the result of a long series of conventions. It's make-believe. You say yes. All money is at heart play money, and all of us have gathered, voluntarily or otherwise, around the board. And this reminded me of the line in the Borges, The Sect of the Phoenix, that goes, "The world is the mirror of the game," which you've written about, how he enacts this in the chess sonnets.
Oh, yeah.
Where the board of the game, which ought to be a representation of reality, in Borges's story, the board is reality. And the battle in the story is subordinated to the board. So we have a reversed hierarchy of representation. The smallest frame somehow becomes the outer frame that contains all the frames.
Yeah.
So as you say in your book on Borges, he literalizes the notion that we are all being played, or as I might say, we've all been framed. But I wonder if I was going to say, I wonder if words are similar to money in this way, which I think you do think it's similar to money this way. If it, going back to the title, trust, they, like money, depend upon the collective agreement, the collective make-believe that this particular sound with our tongue and our palate and our lips and throat, or this scribble with your now legendary 20-year-old fountain pen, which you talk about on Seth Meyers, that scribble means this and not this other thing. That maybe words are the first fiction that create reality, that words are the first fiction that create history. I was going to ask you if this was a forced analogy, but this is my long-winded sort of explication of what I think you've already suggested.
Yeah. No, I can only assent and confirm. If I was drawn to money, it's precisely for the reasons you just pointed out. It is a sign. It is sort of a semiotic event. It's a highly conventional, as all signs are, and yet it's able to touch the world. It has mass. It has a weight, and it's able to make a dent in reality. And this to me was amazing. To pause and think about it, which we take for granted because we live in a modern society. But the fact that we have this sign, this conventional symbol that is able to alter life itself, that has a material effect on our surrounding conditions, was mind-blowing. And I decided actually that was the germ of the project. And I decided to extend that. Well, if a $5 bill can do that, surely a novel can do that as well. Make a dent in reality.
Yeah.
And off we go.
Yeah, no, and I'm confident that your book has and will. I really appreciate you being on the show today, Hernan.
David, I have to say, I feel I've been sort of with a scholar on me. I don't understand why such a person would exist. but here you are, and it's it was very this is one of the most engaging conversations I've had on not just on the book but on literature, and I'm very impressed with all your erudition and everything that went into it, and I'm very grateful to you for having had me on your legendary show. Thank you so much. It is a legendary show.
That's sweet of you to say. We've been talking today to the novelist Hernan Diaz about his latest book, Trust. You've been listening to Between the Covers. I'm David Naiman, your host. Today's program was recorded at the volunteer-powered, non-commercial, listener-sponsored, full-strength, makeshift home office of me, David Naiman. You can find more of Hernan Diaz's work at hernandiaz.net. And if you enjoyed today's conversation, help ensure the future of conversations just like this by joining the community of Between the Covers listener supporters at patreon.com/betweenthecovers, where you can check out a wide variety of potential benefits of doing so. Or if you prefer a one-time donation, you can do so by PayPal at tinhouse.com/support. I'd like to thank the Tin House team, Elizabeth DeMeo and Elisa Ogie in the book division, Jacob Valla in the art department, Becky Kramer in publicity, Lance Cleland, the director of the Summer and Winter Tin House Writers Workshops. Finally, I'd like to thank Imre Lodbrog and Barbara Browning for creating this outro. Their album, Imre Lodbrog E Sapatita Mi, can be found on iTunes, and Barbara Browning's trove of ukulele covers can be found at soundcloud.com/Barbara Browning.